If you have a Bible, you can look at 2 Samuel chapter 6. So go ahead and look that up, 2 Samuel chapter 6. And we're continuing our study on David's life. And this is a pretty amazing story because one of the key characters is the Ark of the Covenant, right? And if you're an Indiana Jones fan, then images come to mind of light beams, killer light beams, and spirits of sorts floating around and causing mayhem. But the Ark of the Covenant is a key character in this story in chapter 6, 2 Samuel. And it was pretty interesting because I was trying to trace the journey of the Ark itself because it's a gold box. I mean, it's essentially a really ornate, really special wood box covered in gold. And there's two cherubim, angels figured on the top, and then God's presence was known to just manifest there as if that was his throne. And these are all things that are images of heavenly places. These are physical representations of things that are spiritual realities. And as you can imagine, this box was pretty significant to the people of God. And so they were given the instructions for it at Mount Sinai. So you remember, they get out of Egypt, they're at Mount Sinai, they're getting all these instructions from God, like the 10 Commandments. And then they get the instructions to build this tabernacle. And so it takes time, but they build this tabernacle tent, and then inside it is the ark. And it's significant because God is limiting himself to a place, or he's making himself available in space and time to people in a kind of finite way that is very tangible. And it's God's presence. And so they're just amazed that the God of the universe, the God who created the whole world, is going to come live with them. Israel, who is just a slave people that just escaped. They're not super special. And yet God is going to live with them. And it's like, I've heard all this stuff so many times, I don't really get the significance of it. But imagine being Israel for the first time, God's Spirit showing up at the tabernacle, right? They're wowed that God would live among them. But there's a lot of regulations and red tape around it because God's not just a trinket or a go show your friends kind of thing, right? He's holy. He's set apart. He's different. And so they have a lot of precautions to make sure to keep people safe from a powerful God that's loving, but he's also a little dangerous if you're not careful. And so they're at Mount Sinai, but unfortunately, we all remember they decide that wandering in the wilderness would be more fun than going to fight big people in the Promised Land. And so they get the joy of following the tabernacle, following God's presence by cloud and fire, and wandering around in the wilderness. But the whole time, the priests, the Levites, they're carrying the ark around. So that's about 40 years they're wandering in the wilderness. Well, then we have the awesome story in Joshua where they actually get to the Jordan River, and who goes first into the river? It's the priests holding the poles with the Ark of the Covenant. God's presence leading the way, parts the Jordan, and they go in. So the Ark's on a pretty cool journey already. Well, then they set up their operating post, their base, their military base in a town called Gilgal across the river inside the Promised Land. And it's there for 7 years while they're going around conquering different people groups and getting them out because now this is God's land. And so people can join Israel, and if they're not going to do that, they're going to get the boot. And so it's at Gilgal. Well, then things kind of calm down, and they move it to this place called Shiloh. And you might have heard of Shiloh. It comes up a couple times in the Bible. And so this is this is where it is for, what I read was 369 years. So this is a long time. So this would be like the whole book of the Judges. And I don't even know if the ark is mentioned in that book. I think it is a little bit, but it doesn't play a major role because mostly Israel's just failing in that book. But the tabernacle set up in this town of Shiloh. Well, then we go down the story a little bit, and at the beginning of 1 Samuel, the Israelites are going to battle against the Philistines, right? Just like the story of David and Goliath, where the Philistines are there and the Israelites are there. Well, this is kind of a similar story preceding that. And there's the Philistines and the Israelites aren't doing so hot. So they get a bright idea. Well, if we got God in a box, we should just take him with us. They don't really consult God on the matter, but they just decide, hey, this magic box, let's take it to the battle. And so they go to this place called Ebenezer, and they go to battle, but the problem is they lose. The Philistines are even like, oh no, there's a God in their camp. Surely we're going to lose. We got to fight harder because they have a God. And God's like, guys, I'm not even with you. And so unfortunately, the ark gets captured by the Philistines, the most sacred and important object to all of Israel, and it gets captured. This is bad news. So what's going to happen? Well, turns out God can take care of himself, in case we didn't know that. And so they have it in their temple because they're like, oh, let's just add this to other gods. That's cool. Well, it makes their idols fall over and their heads break off. And then everybody starts getting tumors. And there's rats. And, they're starting to see, I don't think our lifestyle of pagan worship is fitting with this God. So let's move the box. So they move the box to another town in Philistines. And they're like, cool, look at this golden trophy, look at us. Well, same thing. So then finally they're like, you guys take it. So it goes from this city called Ashdod to this city called Gat to this city called Ekron. And it's in Ekron where they finally say, we need to give this back to those people that it came from in the first place. Because turns out this God is causing trouble for us. And so they actually return it. And they return it on a cart. They have this new cart that they make, like a wagon kind of cart. And they put some oxen on it. And they don't want to get too close to it, so they get the ark on the cart and the oxen, and they point them in the right direction down the road, and they just tell the oxen to go. And they're so happy and thankful when the oxen just keep walking all the way into Israelite territory. Whew! That was a bad dream. We got that out of our hair. And so it ends in this city called Beth Shemesh. And that's pretty cool. The Israelites, they throw a big party because God is going to be present with us once again. We have what he told us to take care of. We have it back. Wow, we're so thankful. But then they decide that they should look inside the box. And remember, God is pure and holy and set apart. And he's so different that if an impure people just come up to him, it's actually dangerous to our health. It's actually dangerous to human beings. And so, guess what? Unfortunately, a number of them die. So then the people of Beth Shemesh decide they don't want it anymore. It's kind of a serious story of hot potato, of passing the Ark of the Covenant around. Nobody seems to want it. And so it ends up in Kiriath Jearim, another town in Israel, at the house of Abinadab. And it's there for about 20 years. And so all of that is the backstory to our story today in the life of David. So 2 Samuel 7. So we have this ark that is, it's amazing that God would dwell with his people, but it can also be amazingly dangerous if you don't acknowledge his holiness. So this chapter is a section in the book, and there's 4 sections. It kind of breaks into 4 sections if you pay attention. So the first section, let's read that. This is going to be chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. And this is going to be an unsuccessful attempt to transport the Ark of the Covenant. Unsuccessful. So, verse 1. David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. He and all his men went to Baalah, which my Bible thankfully tells me a note. That's also known as Kiriath Jearim. So the name got changed at some point, but it's the same place that we just read about the ark landing. Baalah in Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim on the ark. They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it. And Ahio was walking in front of it, and David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, they're going with 30,000 people. And, numbers are interesting in the Bible because numbers, this was not a scientific age, right? In our scientific age, accuracy is everything, right? I can know what my gas mileage is down to the 0.7, 25.7 miles to the gallon or something. So we like that accuracy. But it's interesting because numbers in the Bible, if you start paying attention, you'll see a lot of the repeated numbers again. Or you'll see a lot of conveniently rounded numbers. But it's interesting because so much of 1st and 2nd Samuel is contrasting David and Saul's leadership. And one was a man after God's own heart, and one was not. And Saul, in a couple stories, he brings up his 3,000 chosen men. He has 3,000 chosen men. Well, David one-ups him by 27,000, and he has 30,000 men. And another interesting thing to have to do with numbers is you see that, like in verse 2, it says, from there, the ark of God. So that's how my Bible translates that, the ark of God. But if you look down, let's see, look down at like verse 9. He says, how can the ark of the Lord? So they change the name for it from the ark of God to the ark of the Lord. God's a more generic word. The Lord is Yahweh's, his own given name, Yahweh, the Lord. And what's interesting is if you read, I didn't notice this, but if when reading a commentary, they point out, it says the ark of God 7 times, and then it calls it the ark of the Lord 7 times. And 7 is a number you just see show up in the Bible all the time. And in fact, creation took place in 7 days, as we know. And so it's this number of perfection and completion. And so you just see things through like that in the Bible, and there's often more meaning to numbers in the Bible than we first notice, which is kind of fun to pay attention to. Now, didn't you love the description of the ark? Like, he kind of goes on a little side note of the ark of God, and you should know what it is if you're a Jew reading this story. It's pretty important to your story. But it says, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim on the ark. So unless you forgot whose ark this is, it's God's. This is God's ark. And the Lord Almighty is a specific name for God. This could also be translated Lord of hosts or Lord of angel armies. You know that song that's on the radio a lot? The God of angel armies is always on my side. That's actually this title for God, the God of angel armies. That's actually one name we can give him. And it's cool because the first time that specific name for God is ever used is in the very beginning of 1 Samuel. And so it's kind of new. If you're reading from Genesis, that's kind of the first time you hear that name for God. And so what does that make you think of if it's the God of angel armies? Right? We're reading about David's 30,000 men. We're reading about these Philistine battles. But then, that's all great between humans. But then there's the Lord of the angel armies. And that kind of strikes a contrast of power and importance, right? And so we're kind of getting an idea of, okay, this ark, this God, he's a big deal. Well, what did the Philistines use to transport the ark themselves? Well, if we would have read it, but like I told you, they used a new cart. They thought, a cart that's never been used for anything else. Surely that will be pleasing to this God. Well, sounds like David decided that was a good idea too. So he had a new cart made for them. But it's kind of interesting that that's the same way the Philistines did it is the same way David's doing it, which Coincidence maybe, but as we're going to see, it's a little bit of a problem because the book of Leviticus, if you remember, it talks about the Levites, the priests, carrying the ark with poles. And these poles, there was ringlets for the poles to slip into the ark so that they could carry it. Kind of interesting. And then this section ended with celebration, right? David is leading this celebration. They are so pumped. And why are they so pumped? What are they so excited about? It's about the presence of God coming back to dwell in this unique way in their land. And he's going to take it to Jerusalem, the new capital of Israel. It's the new home of the king. And so it's exciting stuff. But as we're going to see, they were a little premature in their celebration, right? Have you ever prematurely celebrated? Maybe it was a sports game and it just looked like your team was going to win. It was over. And then the Patriots came in and they did it again. Not this year, Tom Brady. But it could be anything, right? We maybe prematurely get excited of, oh, I know I'm going to get this job. The interview went so well. And then we don't. Or something like that. Well, guess what? Verse 6. This isn't going to be good. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah, who had been guiding the ark, reached out and took hold of the ark of God, because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day that place is called Perez Uzzah, or could be translated outbreak against Uzzah. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. Wow. So that seemed a little harsh, didn't it? So this guy Uzzah, he's helping make sure the cart with the ark gets through all right. And his name actually means strength. So we don't know if there's any irony here of like he was trying to impose his own strength to help or something like that. But there's a problem here. His intentions seem honest, right? Like it said the oxen stumbled. And the last thing you want is the ark of a holy God falling in the mud, right? I mean, you're reading along and you're like, oh my goodness, that just seemed a little harsh there, God, if you'll allow me to question what's going on. But we kind of see that there's a number of things that have been going wrong here, and God's been accommodating them because God's always accommodating us. We're far from a perfect people, right? I haven't had a perfect day in my life, I don't think, as for terms of my rightness before God, right? And so God's constantly accommodating us. If he wasn't accommodating us in our hearts' desires that are out of place, or in the things we do that are out of place, or in just kind of our maybe even ignorant idiocy. If he wasn't accommodating us, he wouldn't be able to use his people for anything, right? But what were some of the problems here? Well, Uzzah, he's not of a Levitical heritage. He's not of the family of priests. Uzzah isn't. So those aren't the people who God prescribed very, very, very clearly to be transporting the ark. And then they're using a cart. And the cart might seem really fast because, hey, wheels are a great idea. And it might seem fast, or it might have been what the Philistines did. But God very clearly told them they should be using poles. And he had already made a way for them to transport the ark. And they just decided it wasn't that important. They just thought, that was a good suggestion, God, but we got this. And then you're definitely not supposed to touch the ark. You're not just supposed to touch the box. This is God's holy presence is dwelling right there. And you as an impure person cannot handle the holiness of God. You just cannot handle the pure presence of God like that. And so he dies. And it said that it's irreverent. That's actually the word it uses. It says this was not done with reverence. But kind of if you're kind of looking at it, you're kind of wondering like, well, David, shouldn't you have noticed some of these things ahead of time? Or shouldn't somebody have said something? Because it's not just Uzzah touching it. They've kind of been making some mistakes that aren't very reverential to God. They're just kind of like, oh, God will just accommodate us. And so how does David respond? Well, first he's angry, right? So he names the place Outbreak Against Uzzah. He's just angry. He's just mad. God, why would you take one of your people like this? But then he becomes afraid, and he's like, I don't want anything to do with this ark. And it becomes the hot potato again, right? It's not worth the work. God is a little too powerful for us to handle. So we're just going to take the hot pads off and call it a day. And so they leave it with Obed-Edom. But what happens to Obed-Edom? Well, it says he's blessed. Him and his entire household is blessed. Isn't that amazing? It's just, when you're in the presence of God, you cannot help but be blessed. When you're in the presence of God, you can't help but be blessed. And so he has abundance. And in Chronicles, it actually talks about Obed-Edom more, and it says, well, he was so blessed by God that he had 62 descendants, and it lists all his descendants. So having a big family was a sign of blessing in this time. And so Obed-Edom, he has the presence of God. He welcomes it there. He's of actually a Levitical heritage, actually. He's actually a Levite. And so God actually is just blessing him while his presence is with his family. Which, man, doesn't that make you want the presence of God? Just thinking about that blessing and abundance that God wants to bring us. And so there we go. This section ends, and this section was just the judgment against Uzzah. So we kind of had an unsuccessful attempt to transport the ark, and then the judgment of Uzzah. And now we're going to have a successful attempt to transport the ark. So this one has a little more good news in it, which is encouraging. So look at verse 12. Now King David was told, this is 3 months later, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has, because of the ark of God. So David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord, notice that, not a cart, they're carrying it. Those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps. He sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. Remember the Numbers thing? So they took 6 steps, and then their 7th act is just an act of worship, right? So, whoa, that's pretty cool. Sounds like they're off to a better start already. Verse 14. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and sounds of trumpets. They are excited. Verse 16. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, which is David's wife, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty, the Lord of angel armies. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women, and all the people went to their homes. Wow. I mean, scale 1 to 10, how much better was that transportation? Yeah, probably more of a 10. So that is just a celebratory scene, right? Just the biggest party you can imagine, that's what's going on here. It's good news. God is coming back into the midst of his people, and they're excited. And this time we see reverence, right? Don't we just see they have some reverence. They carry it this time. And this doesn't, it's interesting because 2 Samuel, it kind of gives a condensed version, but if you read the whole story of this in Chronicles, they actually talk about how they didn't have priests carrying it before, and the second time they get that right. And they actually go, okay, maybe since God did give us instructions about this, we should actually use them. Okay, take 2, God, thank you. And then they take 6 steps And what's the thing they do? They stop and they give this offering to God in their seventh act there. And so it's pretty beautiful. It's pretty cool scene that we see there of what right worship looks like and what listening and following God carefully looks like. Well, how did Michal feel about things? Michal, David's wife, Saul's daughter, and Saul is dead by this point. But it's interesting that it says daughter of Saul, right? Who does it link her to? Does it say David's wife, or does it say daughter of Saul, right? And so maybe has she really given her heart to David? Has she really made her husband her new family? Or does she still have more of an identity with her former family? It's kind of a telling title there. And so the other thing I noticed is she's not down there celebrating. David is. David's down there celebrating, and he's wearing a linen ephod. He's not even wearing his kingly robes. He's not wearing what would make him stand out as the king, the ruler of the land of Israel. He's wearing a linen ephod, which is a priest's garment. He's wearing something that identifies a priest, or is significant in that way, but not as a ruler of the people. And so Michal, she's not even joining the procession. She's just watching from a window. So where is her delight in God coming to be with him? It doesn't seem to be there. And instead, she despises David in her heart, which is not going to work out well, because just like we had the judgment on Uzzah, now the final section of the chapter is the judgment of Michal. So this is not going to go well for Michal either. So let's read verse 20. When David returned home to bless his household, he's just full of the blessing, right? He just blessed all the people. He gave them all raisin cakes. I mean, this is just a good day. If you go to a giant civic gathering and you leave with bundles of food in your arms, that's a pretty good day. And so he's coming to bless his whole household now because he is just so excited about God's presence being with them. Well, it says, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. Do you catch any sarcasm there? Believe it or not, the Bible has sarcasm. It's not a 20th century invention. It says, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today. I'm sure that's what you mean, Michal. And what does David say, verse 21? David says to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor." And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. That's Michal's judgment. No kids. And so, not working out well for Michal. And what is she upset about, right? Because when we first read, it says she saw David dancing, leaping before the Lord, and she despised him in his heart. But then when he comes in, she makes it about, well, you're being vulgar, you're being inappropriate, dancing without all your clothes on in front of the slave girls. But really what's going on is he's not showing up as king. He's just showing up as a servant of the Lord. He's just showing up wearing this linen ephod and not trying to show how regal he is, not trying to prove how important he is, not trying to show that he's from the wealthiest family in Israel. Instead, he is becoming an insignificant person, undignified before God, because God is so great. He's just so glad that God's there, that he doesn't care what people think of him. He doesn't care what his status is. He just is focused on God. Isn't that an amazing view of worship? That he's just so focused on rejoicing in God that none of that other noise matters. What other people think, judgments that they might have, it's not really rattling him, right? Because he's just so excited about his God. And he knows that this is the God of angel armies. It matters what he thinks of you, not what these other people think of him, not what even his own wife thinks of him. But she can't stand that because she's still caught up on being the king's daughter and now the king's wife. And that status and prestige is more important to her. And so now if people are going to look at her husband more lowly or more simple or more common, she's not going to have it. But as we see, that doesn't stop David. And he just lays it out there pretty hard. So I can't imagine that was the most fun marital conversation to be around. But it happened, and there it is, right in the Bible. So there we go. And you know what 1 Samuel chapter 2 says? Those who honor me, I will honor. And who's talking? God. That's what we can take to heart. Those who honor me, I will honor. And David has internalized that. He gets that. He knows who it's important to honor. Those who honor me, I will honor. That's what God says. So, that's the story. What an amazing story. And the ark is in Jerusalem. This is just a high point of the story. But what are some takeaways for us, right? We don't have nor need the ark anymore because Christ came. God's presence came in Jesus. And then when Jesus left, he gave us the Holy Spirit. So the ark and the tabernacle has become a beautiful part of our story, but it's not necessarily significant to us in the same way anymore. But there's some takeaways for us. If we want to be a person after God's own heart, which we do, if we want to be a person after God's own heart, this is what it's going to look like. So a person after God's own heart sees that God is set apart. They see that God is set apart. They acknowledge the holiness of God, and they take that seriously. They don't just let that be something that's flippant. So a person after God's own heart sees that God is set apart. And so David and Uzzah, they kind of took God's instructions to just be insignificant suggestions, right? They knew what was written in the past books that had come from Moses. They knew that was there, but, just kind of a suggestion. Let's not overdo it. We're excited. We're rejoicing. We made a new cart. I mean, what more could God want, right? But we see here that actually the details matter. The details matter. And haven't you found that when you pay attention to the details of God and what he's asking of you in your life and you obey him, this actually brings freedom, right? Because they were trying to celebrate prematurely, but they weren't paying attention to following the God they were professing to follow. But when we do obey God and pay attention to his word, it actually just brings a freedom to our life, right? Because God's given us instructions. He's told us how to walk, how to live, and how to care for one another, how to be full of love, how to stay connected to his love. He spelled these things out for us, right? And that actually just brings freedom to our life. It brings joy to our lives. It lets us celebrate when we pay attention to those things and follow them. And so we just got to kind of ask, do we take God's instructions seriously? Being careful not to nonchalantly determine what does and doesn't matter to God, right? Because David and Uzzah, they kind of decided for themselves what did and didn't matter to God. They thought, well, we're bringing the ark back to the tabernacle. That's what matters to God by any means necessary. Well, no. This is a holy God. And, I was kind of thinking about this, and the 10 Commandments were like, okay, well, you can't have any false idols. That's commandment number 2. Commandment number 6, you can't murder anybody. I think those are pretty important to God, right? Wouldn't you agree that's important to God? Number 4, remember the Sabbath. That's just a suggestion. Honor your father and mother. Well, just do your best. God gets. Parents can be hard. No offense, Mom, Dad, if you happen to watch this. Do not covet. Well, yeah, I like their car. Oh, yeah, that's that's a pretty nice house. I wouldn't mind living there. Right? It's just easy for us to decide what does and doesn't matter to God. It's easy to say, oh, do not murder, do not have idols. But if I'm going down the street and I think, wow, it'd be nice to live in that house, and then I start dwelling on that, and then I become discontent with the home God's given me. And then I just find myself thinking about, well, how do I get out of what I have and into that, right? And it's good to have goals. It's good to have desires. But that's something I find for myself, that sometimes I really struggle with contentment, right? And that comes back to coveting. Well, maybe that's actually serious to God, and I need to be careful not to just think it's not a big deal. Because it's part of God's instructions. He says, do not covet. And actually, if I don't and I can learn contentment in God, I'm just going to be freer. I'm just going to have more joy in my life if I follow his instructions. So, a person after God's own heart sees that God is set apart, that he's holy. And a person after God's own heart, this is the second thing, seeks after God's presence. A person after God's own heart, they want to be in God's presence. They want the blessing that comes with being near to God. They want that. They desire it. And I was just talking to Ben before the service because he's writing a song with a friend, and he was showing me part of it, and one of the lines was similar to what I had just written down in my notes today. And I wrote down, so much of the time I settle for so little. You know, so much of the time I settle for so little when God's offering me this abundance. And, you know, they're busting out the raisin cakes. It's this scene of abundance, of God's blessing, of God's presence is a good place to be. And Obed-Edom, he's just blessed by being with the Lord. And I think sometimes I just settle for so little, of just a little taste of God, and then I go on my way, right? Instead of just cultivating that abiding, continuing relationship in God's presence throughout the day and just enjoying the wealth of love, joy, and peace that flow out of abiding in God and being present with him consistently. And so David, he really seeks God's blessing. I mean, he's going through a lot of work to get this ark here, right? 30,000 men, every instrument he could think of, biggest celebration ever. All these offerings to God. He really wants God's blessing. He really wants God's presence. He just desires it, right? And I just think, what if we, people after God's own heart, had that desire for God? What if we just had that hunger and that thirst for him and for the blessing that comes from being with him? And that's something I want God to cultivate in me, just to even have that hunger and then figure out how to work that out and to just be abiding with him and be living in his presence all the time. Because we can. We have the Spirit. We can do that. But it just takes some work to tap into and to get used to and to listen to God. And I just wanted to turn to Matthew real quick and just read this. Matthew 5, here's some words about blessing under our new covenant with Jesus. Here's some words about blessing. It's just worth reading because it's so amazing. It's Matthew chapter 5, and this is the famous Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is giving kind of the sermon to end all sermons. And this is how he opens it. So this crowd gathers on the hillside, and they come together, and he says, you want to know who's blessed? Check this out. Verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is the place of God's presence. To the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn or have lost the things that are important to them, for they will be comforted. God's going to take care of them. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. The meek are the people that are not trying to be somebody else. They're content with who God made them to be. For they will be the inheritors of the earth. They're going to be given possession. And they're going to be rulers in God's kingdom. Verse 6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. That desire, that hunger, God honors that. Verse 7. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Those that show care and compassion, God's going to turn right back around and bless them with his mercy and compassion. Verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Those that are desiring to have a heart that's aligned with God, that are desiring to walk in a way that is holy, they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Wow, isn't that amazing? That is the blessing of God that we can desire for our own lives. And it even gives us a hint of what those who are going to be honored in God's kingdom look like and what their lives are marked by, and what we can seek to cultivate in our own lives just to be a part of this blessed people in God's presence. So, a person after God's own heart seeks after God's presence and his blessing. And finally, a person after God's own heart goes all in on God. They go all in on God. And we saw David dancing with all his might, right? It said twice, he danced with all he had. It was with utter abandon. He was just all in on God. He was captivated. He didn't need anything else. It was with all his might. While Michal watched from the window, right? And she criticizes from the sideline. Isn't that interesting? She doesn't jump into the game. She doesn't get down and join the worship and then go, oh, this wasn't really that great. Or, oh, I'm not so sure about God. Or, I think we kind of humiliated ourselves, David. But at least she tried. She just watches from the window. And what came to mind for me is that if you criticize from the sideline, you're about to fall into a pride trap. If you're keeping yourself safe on the sideline, then you're about to fall into a pride trap. And I thought, for me and a lot of the people I'm around, or even things I've said or thought, it's easy to judge, the Catholics, right? And we can kind of throw our own opinions about, the Catholics. Or we can throw our own opinions about, the charismatics. These more charismatic denominations, they this, that, and the other thing. And we can kind of just throw out some criticisms, but we're kind of from the outside looking in, throwing our criticism, right? And that's just it's a trap of pride, of thinking we know best, or we have the answers, or we know it's right. And there's just some danger there that we got to be careful. If we're on the sideline, not to just be lobbing our criticism out, we might end up like Michal. And that's not really a place we want to be, right? And it's true, every tradition has their strengths and weaknesses. There's no doubt about it. But we just got to be careful there. And the other thing is that a prideful heart cannot accept looking foolish, right? Michal, she can't accept looking foolish, or that her husband looked undignified and not regal. And that's pride. A prideful heart cannot accept looking foolish. And I thought about that, and I just thought, am I willing to be perceived a fool for being in love with God? If I'm in love with God and I'm just living out and people think I'm foolish, then shoot, am I okay with that? I mean, if you read that Bob Goff book, Everybody Always, he's not afraid of looking like a fool. He's kind of a goofball sometimes, but what he's doing is motivated by the love of God. And I thought, how many times have I thought about witnessing or evangelizing an opportunity, but the thing that held me back is I didn't want to look foolish. I didn't want to look foolish or silly for my beliefs or for trying to share them with someone, right? So am I okay with being perceived a fool because I'm so in love with God? And I hope so, because David was, and he's our example here. So we'll close with this verse. Matthew 23:12. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. That's the kingdom of our God. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who humble themselves will be exalted. And let's take that to heart as the people of God, as people after God's own heart. By his grace, by his love, by his mercy, he has made that possible for us to be people after his own heart. And we are already his children, and that is already a blessed place to be. But let's seek even more. Let's seek more blessing. Let's continue to desire after God's presence.